Testing. We are testing, and I have one hair that's way out of line here. I don't know what to do with that. Hello, and welcome to week number 8 of no, it's week number 9 actually of Foundations of Worship and Preaching, and then you have a week off, and then we do our last week. This week we get to do one of the things that, well, it's just something I get really excited about. As somebody who's studied a lot of preaching, a lot of homiletics, I'm always quite interested in the form of the sermon. There are forms and styles of everything that we do, right? You take a novel, for instance, lots of different styles of novel, but novel is one form of writing, one form of storytelling. There's poetry, but there's lots of different forms of poetry. Jokes, knock-knock jokes is one form of a joke. Um, all these different things have different genres, and different subgenres have different cadences, different styles. You begin here, you go there, and then you end, right? So sermons are like that too. And this brilliant little book, Determining the Form, by O. Wesley Allen Jr., is a great little book on the forms of the sermon that we've had around for many years. What's lovely about this book is it's kind of divided up into there's kind of two different eras of preaching that he's looking at. Chapters 1 to 6 are really those kinds of sermons that you and I grew up with. I'm in my early 50s. And I grew up with a lot of the sermons that are in chapters 4, 5, and 6, right? Propositional lesson sermons, which is the 3-point sermon, right? And exegesis, interpretation, application sermons. And what's the next one? Verse by verse sermons. These are all sermons that have been around for hundreds of years and even more. Luther and Calvin used verse by verse sermons a lot. Not medieval England, but later England, like in the 16, 17, 1800s, oh, they loved the points sermons, like not 3 points, but 11 points. So the first part of the book, from those 3 chapters, chapters 4, 5, and 6, look at these kinds of sermons that were very lecture-like. But then we move in chapter 7 and beyond to types of sermons that are more story-like. That's probably the best way to say it. Some sermons are more lecture-like and some are story-like. And this book divides them up quite nicely and gives some good explanation, and there's a biblical text that carries you through. But one of the things to ponder here as you look at this book is the sermons that are more lecture-like, the ones that we preached a lot before, probably 1970, 1980. Things really changed in the 70s and 80s. So the ones sort of before that, in the most of sort of the Protestant world and somewhat in the Mennonite world, the ones before that, the important thing about the sermon was, what is this sermon about, right? And what is the sort of moral lesson here, right? But what the sermon is about is the most important thing. Is it about God? Is it about how we should be better? Is it about the atonement? Is it about creation? What is it about? Probably the best way to think about the sermons and the kinds of forms that have been developing after the 60s, 70s, in that era, and starting with chapter 7 and beyond in this little book. It does matter what the sermon is about, but more the question is, what is the sermon doing? Because what we have since the 70s and 80s are sermons that are more narrative-like. So if the sermons previous to that are more lecture-like, where you start with, I'm going to say this, I'm going to say God is love, and then I'm going to try to prove it in a number of ways. The narrative sermon, in a broad sense of narrative, the narrative sermon, or the sermon that comes in the 60s, 70s, and so on, that sermon is going to pose a problem, tell a story at the beginning that's going to have us wondering if God loves us. And then we're going to go through some kind of process, some kind of plot, really, that will get us to an answer or a response to that question. So that's a kind of summary of the radical difference that came about in preaching in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and this book talks about it. It deals with it quite well. So take a look at that. You'll notice that chapter 7 is called The 4 Pages of the Sermon, and that's the sermon that you're going to preach when you come here to preach in June, to be a part of the class in June. This is a wonderful kind of sermon. I fully admit that this is my professor, Paul Scott Wilson, who, well, he didn't invent it. It was out there, but he was able to name it in a particular way. It just looks at 4 different movements of a sermon. You start here, you do this, you do this, you do this, and then you're done. And all sermons will do that. There's a section here, and a section here, and a section here, and a section here, and then you're done. And how do you move through those sections? What are those sections? And so on. So take a look at that, and read the whole book. It is 80 pages, folks. Again, I really enjoy these shorter books. And maybe what you want to do with your posts this week is just bring up some questions about some of the things that you see there. Are some of these forms familiar? Some of them not familiar? That kind of thing. And then the assignment not for this week. This assignment is actually due April 17th, which is way down the road in a way. I wanted to have several Sundays for you to have an opportunity to listen to one sermon and do an analysis. So there's a sermon analysis assignment. Keep it simple, maybe just 1 or 2 sentences maximum for every question that's there. There are lots of different ways to analyze or evaluate a sermon. A friend of mine who did his doctorate in preaching or homiletics at Princeton, he did a study of 120 different evaluation forms for sermons, right? There's a lot of them out there because every sermon evaluation form is looking for something specific. And in this particular evaluation form or analysis form that I have here, what I'm asking you to do is get at some of those things that we have already talked about, like the 3 worlds of the text, and then also some things that we're going to look at as we move forward. So take a look at that assignment, and if you have any questions about it, let me know. So the idea here is that at some point between now and April the 17th, you will be in some place where you can hear a sermon, and then you can do an analysis of that sermon. You don't have to. It doesn't have to be a live sermon. You can find a sermon on YouTube. You can find your favorite preacher who's out there somewhere, and if you have a sound recording or a video recording of it, digital recording, you can use that as well. Or if there's a printed sermon that you know about that you like, you could also analyze that sermon as well. We're just going through an exercise here of taking a look at sermon form, and then asking those questions of an actual sermon. So please let me know if you have any questions about this, and do put your questions up with your posts this week, your questions or comments regarding form, and take a look at that sermon analysis assignment. Have a great week.